I first heard about the Mexica movement through a friend of mine, my tattoo artist. We had been discussing a lot of different issues, such as the European absorption of Native American culture, and about spirituality and Christianity and how it affected the Native peoples. And he mentioned at some point that he was going to be attending a protest against the canonization of Junipero Serra, and I actually wrote a thesis about him in school and was curious why there would be a protest against it. I'm not Catholic, I don't have a lot of the background there, and I didn't know the history at the time, but he informed me of what this one Franciscan did at the time, along with others in the missions, and that effect on the indigenous peoples at the time. And him talking about going to this protest and about what had happened made me curious about the people that were putting on the protest. And at that time, he mentioned the Mexica movement. He didn't get into a lot of detail about it, but I did a little online research and had more questions than I had answers. So as he continued to work on my tattoo at the time, we would talk more and more about issues that the Mexica movement addresses, and about the history and the education of the Nican Tlaca people. And that was really my what sparked my curiosity and my interest to know more. My first reaction to what I understood the Mexica movement to stand for was shock. I read it as, in my very uneducated mind at the time, as reverse racism, and I thought, they just want to send all white people back to Europe, and they're hateful, and I had nothing to do with what happened back in 1492, and it certainly wasn't my fault that there was continued oppression, and I had a lot to learn. And I think I started reading Olean's blog at that point, and when the many questions that arose out of his writings came up, I would discuss that with Frankie, and he would help me. He kind of translated it a little bit and helped me to understand his viewpoint on it. But it took a lot of education, a lot of study on my part to understand my role in this and the continued genocide of the indigenous people, and why there's a need for us to give back the land. There's a need for us to take accountability and dismantle white supremacy, and give back Seminawak. I think whiteness is a misnomer, and it's dangerous in that it is portraying Europeans as being pure and without any kind of guilt or association to the acts of their ancestors and the continued acts of white supremacy on this continent. And it's not an accurate term. We're not white, we're more pink. I think it's perpetuating a myth that whiteness is the goal. It's what you should be trying to achieve, and that's very dangerous. And I intentionally use the word European as much as I can, but unfortunately I think a lot of my fellow Europeans don't understand who you're talking about when you say that, and that's a matter of my trying to educate further and maintaining the truth. My first understanding of white supremacy, and I think this is common to most Europeans, is that we're brought up and indoctrinated to believe that white supremacy entails something very obvious, like Ku Klux Klan or Nazis with the symbolic uniforms and hate speech and obvious violent acts against people of color. But from what I've learned over the last 2 years, that this white supremacist system it encompasses so much more, and it encompasses a lot of racism that's very covert, very hidden away. It is coming out more in Trump's administration, and it's becoming more obvious because people are being encouraged to show their hate, that it's okay to hate again. And this is a way of maintaining white supremacy, of maintaining the structures that keep people of color oppressed, that keep them in a position of having to fight for every single step of the way, where Europeans have that privilege and don't even realize they have it. And there's, I'm sure, many different ways of fighting white supremacy. And I think number one is to recognize your white privilege and to use it for in ways that can benefit people of color, or to diminish it in any way you can, and to obviously educate yourself on a continuous basis. Listen to people of color, listen to what's important and how you can get involved, and just get involved, get active, do something about it. Don't sit by the wayside and just say, well, this is the way it's always been. No, we need to break this down. I think there's a lot of confusion out there with Europeans whose families have perpetuated a myth in their genealogical history that there was this uncle or that grandmother that had some indigenous blood. I don't think I've ever met a European that doesn't have some story about, well, there's some of this kind of blood on this side of my family, and it's not. For myself, I was raised to believe that I had Cheyenne, Winnebago. I was taught that I have these ancestors that it was never clear exactly which ancestors they were, which branch of the family they came from, what their names were, what their history was. But it was the fallback that we have this native blood, and that's why we have some kind of belonging to this continent. And I think that's a lot of where that comes from in over centuries, not just over our lifetimes. But I think that this is something that's been built to maintain an illegal occupation, and that this is a way that Europeans can claim some kind of right to this land that they don't have. And for myself, I needed to know specifics, so I took a DNA test and was absolutely shocked to discover I have 0% indigenous blood. I was crushed because this is how I identified and how I had believed all my life. And it took some time to absorb that and to understand what it meant. And I think any European that has a true desire to start breaking down the system of white supremacy owes it to themselves first and foremost to get that DNA test done. Know your truth. Don't speak about having a 14th Cherokee or whatever it is that you think you have in your family. Find out and know it for fact. I think if someone is genuinely interested in getting involved in dismantling white supremacy, the first thing they need to do is start educating themselves. Learn what the actual history is, and it's not what we were mostly taught in school. That is largely fabricated to maintain the systems of oppression that exist in this country. You need to find out what the actual truth was, and there are a multitude of books out there that can help you. There are multiple resources that can help you. The Mexica movement website can help you. There are so many ways that you can educate yourself that for you to remain ignorant with any kind of desire to truly help is not acceptable. Getting your knowledge is first, and then get involved. Get involved with the organization, get involved with helping in protests, get involved in educating others, get to know people of color, listen to them. Listen, first and foremost. have noticed that during protests that reporters will approach me first rather than the people of color that are in attendance at the protest. I was really surprised by it the first time it happened, in the sense that it made no sense to me. I don't know why they would come to me when, in my eyes, I was the least educated of the people that was present. But I wasn't thinking through the lens of white supremacy. And once I realized that they were coming to me because somehow my opinion was considered more valued, I just learned that when they come to me, I turn them over to Aline or to Nailot or to someone who's there that can speak to the issues better than I can. Early on, when I first went to a protest in Sacramento, there was a mainstream media reporter there who interviewed myself and the three Nican Tlaca people who were with me. And she talked to each one of us for the same length of time, and what each of us said, I think, had value. But when the story actually came out the next day, it was entirely my comments only, and they were taken out of context and misquoted. There was nothing at all of the three people that I was there with, and that was very upsetting to me. And I immediately called them and asked them to retract it, and of course they didn't. They just left it as this is the face they wanted to put on how they disseminated the news, how they made it more palatable to people. And that is absolutely not the way it needs to be done. And I've learned my lessons with that when reporters come to me, I check myself. The story that needs to be heard, the voices that need to be heard, are those of people of color, not mine. I am spending my time fighting white supremacy in a number of ways. I do go to every single Mexica movement protest. I do attend any other activities for the Mexica movement that are available. I enjoy the companionship of the Nican Tlaca in these meetings, but I also learn a great deal in the conversations that we have. I learn a lot at the protests from people who come to either support or argue with us. There's a great deal to learn just by listening and interacting with people. I also am in the process of going through the Mexica movement recommended book list. I'm still on the first book, but I'm trying to absorb a great deal, and I think taking your time with it and learning as much as you can from that list is definitely a good start for anyone trying to understand these issues, especially for Nican Tlaca trying to understand their own identity. But for me, it helps me to understand their perspective and what I can do to be helpful. I also write quite a bit on my Facebook about what I'm learning and my own experiences. Sometimes these are directed to Europeans. Sometimes it's more of a relation to Nican Tlaca. And sometimes it's talking about issues that come up or posts that Aline has done. I do have several other Facebook pages that I'm involved with. One that fights overt white supremacists, exposing and relating what's going on with groups like the neo-Nazis and the KKK and those obvious white supremacist groups. But that line is getting thinner and thinner in Trump's administration, where it's hard to determine anymore where the hate groups are and where hate is. And I have another page that's Europeans Against White Supremacy, and this is more geared toward educating curious Europeans or Europeans that have some level of knowledge about ongoing issues that affect people of color and the white supremacist systems and how we can fight those. So I'm involved in a number of different ways, some with protests, some with education, and obviously with educating myself. I've faced a lot of different responses from my family and from friends who are European. For the most part, there is a concerted effort to shut me down and silence me. And they may do it in polite ways. They might just be suggesting other conversation, but they clearly are uncomfortable with the truth. And my response to that has been largely to cut ties with any European that is not at least open to discussion. Obviously, I can't do that with family members, but I do maintain what I believe, and I will not back down from it, and I won't make it easy and comfortable for them. I do try and educate where I'm able to, and I do try and associate with Europeans who are, like me, trying to learn and trying to do the right thing. I think the Trump administration is a very dangerous time for people of color, in that he has surrounded himself with other white nationalists. He has made his cabinet, and every office of this administration is another form of reaffirmment that speaking out about white pride is perfectly acceptable, that it's what we need to be doing, because Europeans are going to be in the minority very shortly. They are now, I think. Regardless, Europeans are afraid of being in the minority. They're afraid that they're losing something. And he's feeding into that with everything he's got. Him, Bannon, they're both set on stoking the fear in the white psyche, the European psyche, to make people of color the enemy and to make it acceptable to harm them, to hurt their families, to deport them, to every possible evil this man is capable of. And he is setting into motion all of the systems that he needs to make these directives happen. And there's no one stopping him. It doesn't seem to matter how many protests we go to or how many people walk in the streets and protest. There's a sense with the majority of Europeans that his behavior is acceptable and will be permitted, and we cannot allow that. I think the people who support Trump and who support specifically Mexican deportation and keeping Muslims out of the country and all of the other aspects of hatred and misunderstanding against people of color, I think these people are not understanding the full scope of their views. I don't think they believe that they're racist. They think they're not. They think they're thinking the right things and doing the right things to protect their country. But to those people, I would strongly suggest that if you feel so certain about that, that you have nothing lost in talking to people of color and in educating yourself about the true history of this country and understanding that this belongs to the indigenous people. It has always belonged to the indigenous people, and that any border has been man-made by Europeans.